Thanks for joining us for another session tonight. Last week we looked at the promise of virtual reality. This week we'll look at entry points into using virtual reality in the classroom. We will focus on the headsets. In addition to that, we'll also look at pedagogy and technology in relation to the implementation of VR in a lesson. With me tonight is Mr. Jacob Bates from the University of Central Florida. Mr. Bates is also the team lead for the Tech Rangers. In addition, we have Dr. Bennett, and Dr. Bennett is a past colleague of mine and also currently working at the University of Clemson as a lecturer. At this point, I turn it over to Mr. Bates.
Thanks, Rohan. So today I'm going to talk about the devices I have in front of me here. Basically, I'm going to start with the entry-level VR technology. So you may have heard of the HTC Vive or the Oculus Rift, but really those are pretty expensive. So we're going to start down here at the bottom end for educational use. So right here in the beginning, we have the Google Cardboard. This was released in 2014 by Google as kind of a way to kickstart the VR ecosystem. They're very inexpensive, and they're actually made by multiple manufacturers. The specifications for these are open to the world, so this one was actually free from a conference. One of the benefits is that you just use your phone. You just unhook this, put your phone in, and you view VR content through your phone screen, so you don't have to buy any new hardware as far as like technology hardware goes. It's just this, and you use your existing smartphone. One of the drawbacks, though, is that it's not very comfortable. This is just, there's no padding here, there's no strap, so you have to hold it up to your face the entire time. Another big drawback is that a lot of users experience nausea or headaches after some experience after any VR experience, but especially with the lower resolution, lower refresh rate that the cardboard or that your cell phone has, rather, you'll have a lot of users experiencing that. So then we're going to move over to the next step up, which is, in this case, it's the Google Daydream View. But equivalent to this is the Samsung Gear VR, and there are a couple others out there. These work in the same principle as the cardboard. It's just you can think of them as a much nicer cardboard. Again, you put your phone in, you look through your phone screen. But this has padding. This actually has a motion tracking remote, so the user can click and point at and interact with objects in the scene. The problem with these is that you have to have a compatible phone with them. So the Daydream View has 24 phones that it's compatible with. The Samsung Gear VR has something like 16 phones that it's compatible with. So it kind of limits what your students can have, what they can use this with. But the biggest benefit of this is that the nausea and headaches issue is mitigated quite a bit, because they have standards as to the refresh rate and the resolution of the screens for the phones that are compatible with this headset here. So now we're going to move over to something a little bit different. This is kind of a newer idea. It's actually the same kind of idea as the Daydream or the Gear VR, except this is the Oculus Go. I believe there's also an HTC equivalent of it. But this is the same kind of thing, but it's like the cell phone is built into this device. So it has dedicated screens, it has its own battery, it has its own processor and memory. It has Wi-Fi, everything. It actually uses the same kind of hardware that a cell phone does, but it's not a cell phone. It's a headset. So we call these a standalone headset. The great thing about these is the price. These are $200. The cheapest one is $200. Now that might seem like a lot, but if you have a completely base model Android phone that is not compatible with a Daydream, and maybe the cardboard is just not high enough fidelity, $200 is way cheaper than a flagship high-end cell phone to put into a Daydream. So yeah, these are great. They also additionally they have their own motion controller, which is a bit more capable than the one that comes with the Daydream View. One limitation that all of these have is that they only track the position, like where you're looking with your head and the tilt of your head. If you move around in the scene, it doesn't register those movements. So that's the big limitation that all of these have. So that's basically it. Of course, there's higher end units, but we won't be covering those today. So I'll send it right back over to you, Rohan.
Thank you, Mr. Bates, for that wonderful overview on the headsets. At this point in time, I turn it over to Dr. Bennett, who will paint the landscape for pedagogy and technology considerations.
Thank you, Dr. Jawala. There are some considerations when you plan virtual reality for academic experiences with your students. First, the context. You have to consider the context. How does the virtual reality experience that you plan to provide fit into the overall context and plan of the lesson? Is it just something that's being added because it's kind of cool and has something to do with the lesson? Or is the experience being added because it fits well with what you're doing and further enhances or connects students with the concepts that you plan to teach? Management and procedures also have to be considered. The management of the experience should be planned just as any other part of your lesson, and the management of your general learning space. We often think of procedures and management as something that pertains to just our physical classrooms, but you'll be asking your students to move into an extension of your physical learning space. So it's still a learning space. Therefore, each individual VR experience calls for careful consideration of management and procedural items that will be important in order to make the experience positive and an experience that your students can learn from. And reflection. Reflection is also an important part of the process. Upon completion of the experience, as an educator, you've got to reflect about what went well, what didn't go well, and how improvements can be made the next time you do this virtual reality experience, specifically as it relates to delivery and management, and how you manage and deliver future virtual reality experience. As with any technology, those who plan to use virtual reality for academic experiences and purposes should develop a technological thinking mindset. So learn how to evaluate hardware and software to understand the features and functions in a manner where you get exactly what those features and functions do, and how the power of each of those features and functions can be used to deliver content in a way that supports the cognitive processes of your students as you guide them toward desired learning outcomes. In the reflection process, ask yourself, did the experience support my students as I wished it had? And if not, what changes do I need to make? So again, here we're going back to that reflection after it's all done. So scalability and best practices. What might work in order to scale and use best practices within any virtual reality experience? In order to make sure that your experience moves forward in a way, moves forward smoothly, as an educator, you've got to consider access. Will my students be able to access the experience as I need them to? That includes hardware and software and support. Can they access all of that? Do I need to provide that? How does that happen? Also, availability. Will the necessary hardware and software for this virtual reality experience be available to my students when they need it? And specifically when they need it to be available to them in order to go through this experience as you need them to. Just because they can gain access to it does not mean that it's going to be available when they need it. So you also have to consider barriers. Peggy Ertmer in 1999 talked about first order and second order barriers. First order barriers would be things like access and availability, time, etc. Second order barriers really deal with our beliefs as educators about technology integration in general, pedagogical beliefs, our fears about integrating, those kind of things. So addressing those barriers beforehand and really understanding what we're getting into and getting over some of those barriers is important. And time and planning. Exactly how does the experience fit within the overall plan, and what will need to be what will be needed in order to make sure that every student is able to participate and learn from the experience. All of that has to be planned beforehand. So I want to go ahead and pass this back over to Dr. Jawala.
Thank you, Mr. Beats, for the presentation, and Dr. Bennett for your overview on the issue of pedagogy and technology for considerations. In addition, I want to encourage everyone to think about both issues as you think about incorporating this sort of technology in your class. The landscape of education is changing, and as the landscape changes, we must give consideration to the ethical issues. Join us next week as we talk about the ethical issues